So the title of my talk is going to be Postcolonial Children's Literature, the Italian Case. And the lecture is organized in 3 sections. So first, I will dig a bit into the colonial archive. So Italian children's literature and the construction of the racialized other. Then I will move to postcolonial children's literature by mapping the field and outlining the scholarship available on the topic. And the third section is going to be an exploration on how contemporary texts set out to write back to these colonial archives and suggest new critical directions. Also, before starting, I would like to say that all the translation in the PowerPoint are mine. So I'm sorry if they don't meet your expectations. And then I also want to warn that this presentation contains images and materials from colonial archives that are disturbing and can and might be offensive. And they are, of course, included just for historical and critical purposes, as talking about children's literature is very complicated not to add images. So today, I would like to start with a story. And this story is La storia d'un naso. In English, The History of a Nose. Published in 1908 by Luigi Bertelli under the pseudonym Vamba, that is should be quite familiar to the Italian audience because he gave us a very famous children's novel titled Giamburrasca. La storia di un naso is a tale for young readers. So the protagonist is an Italian boy named Maso, who persists in the habit of inserting his fingers into his nose, which by consequence grows bigger and bigger. This new appearance of Maso with a big nose starts a chain of comic misadventures in rhyme. So the whole novel is written in verses, as he is kidnapped by a troupe of acrobats. So the story, on a superficial level, has been read, and it still is, a hygiene fable designed to teach good manners to children through laughter. And also I want to mention that in this first edition that that you have the picture here in the slide, the subtitle says, Questo è un libro divertente. So this is a fun book. So this work was first performed. So it was performed on 14th January 1906 and read aloud in the Niccolini Theatre in Florence by the actor Luigi Rasi. So the printed record of that event appeared in 1908, and the following editions went throughout all the mid-20th century. Such as the 5th edition that you can see here, and it was like illustrated by Corrado Sarri, who at the time was a quite well-known illustrator. And surprisingly enough, it was republished in 2011, after almost 50 years, by the publisher Robin. And you also have the image of this new edition. As you can see from the covers, it's quite clear that the history of a nose is a colonial racist product. And we have to recall the colonial history of Italy. In 1908, Italian Somaliland was instituted, and in 1911, Italians fought in the Italo-Turkish War. So Italy invaded Libya. So we are in the full colonial moment before fascism, because then there will be, like, as we will see, a revival of colonialism. So when the acrobats abducted Maso, so they choose him because he has a very big nose. They do it to pass him off as an Abyssinian, so a black man coming from the Horn of Africa, in their spectacles. So they want to put him in a circus and make of this nose an exhibition. But to make the deception plausible, they paint him in blackface. So I would like to read with you a part of this text. I'm going to read the English translation. And smearing his face with grease and black soot, she, who is the dancer of the circus, shouted in her usual booming voice, "From now on, and remember this, you are a Moor from East Africa." And not everyone can read the Italian text, but I just want to make it clear that this is like in rhyme. So the last two verses are: gli diceva, d'ora innanzi tienilo a mente, tu sei un Moro dell'Africa d'Oriente. Moor is a dispregiative term for African of Mauritania, that was like the north of Africa. So this text places the child protagonist at the intersection of two regimes of othering, that which marks the child as pre-rational in need of discipline, and that which marks the colonial subject as racially inferior, primitive, but also available for spectacle. So Maso is painted in black precisely because blackness signifies something that can be exhibited and that is inherently spectacular and alien. So when Maso is painted in blackface and made to perform as an Abyssinian in the acrobat spectacle, the performance is not only visual, so it is also linguistic. So Maso is required not merely to look like a Moor, but to sound like a Moor. And I also want to add that he is also dressed as in a very stereotypical way, and also he is required to eat raw meat. But let's focus on the sounding. So the sounding in this text means the production of pure noise. And let's read another passage. So Maso had already begun to speak like a Moor, and then strange fantasies of every kind, and shouting harshly what seems a war hymn, or muttering what sounded like a prayer, now gazing languidly, now fiercely. He kept repeating the following refrain: Biribi, sharakaranga, barabao, shasha, shakwarakara, nyaranyareo. A sequence of sounds that mimics the phonetic surface of an unfamiliar tongue while emptying it of all semantic content. So the syllables are designed to be comic, to provoke laugh in the Italian child reader. And of course, the African subject, in this case Maso, is a subject that cannot speak. Why did I start with this story? Because unfortunately, as we know, the history of Maso is part of a much larger archive of European children's fiction. And so let's start with the first section. And I want to start talking about it with this picture that the photographer Leone Contini granted me the permission to display. So this is like a picture that is part of a project titled Bel Suol d'Amore, the Scattered Colonial Body, which is part of a bigger European program titled Traces, Transmitting Contiguous Cultural Heritages with the Arts. So the specific Italian work investigates the dispersed collections of the former Colonial Museum in Rome that was created during Fascism, and now is like, it has been taken down and but hidden in the archives and storage spaces. There are still these kind of objects that remain inaccessible to the larger public. And according to this group of scholars and artists, they have become undigested remnants of Italian colonial history. So the project approaches them as an archaeology of collective amnesia, as we know that the colonial history still remain quite marginal both to the public discourse and also the academic one. So in order to talk about the colonial archive, I would like to go a step back in talking about the late 19th century. So the late 19th century in Italy, but also like in other parts of Europe, saw the emergence of an adventure literature for children that was heavily influenced by the broader European tradition of colonial romance. So typically, distant exotic spaces were populated by racialized others that serve as the stage of Italian heroism. And one of the most prominent writers of this period is Emilio Salgari, who also was one of the most productive writers we ever had. And he wrote a series of these books that you can see in the slide, and he established the template of a world of elsewhere populated by figures whose alterity is both fascinating and subordinate. As Maria Trullo has showed very sharply, books produced in this period were intrinsic of a cataloging force, and she brings this example of I drammi della schiavitù, so the dramas of slavery, published in 1896, where Trullo retraces, and I quote, European colonialist strategies of measuring, naming, and thus bringing to light the hidden wonders, dangers, and resources of the dark continent. And I continue with Trullo. These overly racist depictions were adumbrated by mapping strategies that aimed to promote the maturation of Italian children and the modernization of the Italian nation through plotting the abjection of the other. And we will see this, we will keep in mind these mapping strategies, because then in the post-colonial corpus, writers take this back and counter-map those mapping strategies. So from this late 19th century, then we arrive to the most popular characters that were already presented in the first decade of the 20th century. And here I just mentioned two of the most the most well-known character of this Corriere dei Piccoli, which was like a children's magazine running from 1908 to 1995. And you can see the first one, Bilbul, who was an Ethiopian protagonist of Attilio Mussino's comic stripe, that really condenses the visual grammar of colonial racism into a format designed for the youngest readers. And on the side, there is Tidna Danna, that was created a decade later by Antonio Rubino, and continues the same tradition between the 1920 and the 1930. I also want to mention that this book, Le storie nere del Corriere dei Piccoli, is an edited book by Laura Scarpa that I really suggest you to read if you have the opportunity, because they collect all the protagonists of this Corriere dei Piccoli, and they make like a very fascinating analysis on it. So these pre-fascist characters then were obviously even more transformed into the fascist period. And before seeing what kind of literature, I just want to speak a bit more about the fascist child. So fascism, as all the other dictatorships, started with a great interest in regulating children's lives. And children's literature has been one of the protagonists of this reform. So one example that I just want to briefly mention is the National Conference for Children's and Youth Literature that took place in Bologna in 1938, which also marks the year in which racial laws were promulgated in Italy. Organized by the National Agency for Popular and School Libraries, together with the National Fascist Union of Authors and Writers, this conference was mostly about censorship. So they were like discussing what kind of production for children should have been in touch with. So from comics to radio programs. We also have to mention that the single-state school textbook was already there when this conference took place. But in general, it was about censorship. And on this occasion, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, who we know to be the founder of Futurism, wrote the Manifesto of Youth Literature. So Filippo Tommaso Marinetti is very known for all the manifestos that he wrote on futurism. So I went to read this manifesto, and among all the points of this extensive revision on children's literature, one of them has struck me more than the other, and it is against foreign literature. So I just want to mention that according to him, Mary Poppins, and I quote, alienates children from their parents in order to create blind submission to the governess. So During fascism, colonial children's literature takes a renewed direction, also because we have to remember that in 1936, Italy invaded Ethiopia. So here I'm generalizing a lot, but there are, of course, different racialized others for different historical periods, and here most of them are Ethiopians. And I just want to briefly read what other scholars have detected from these texts. So this enemy, this racialized other, was ugly, vulgar, boorish, in the frenzy of the dances, barbarian, but also childish and naive, savage, ignorant, coward. As Patrizia Palumbo reminds us, this fascist production had also a gendered side. And here I want to quote her in saying that in these texts, written in response to the Ethiopian War and the formation of the empire, girls are either absent or portrayed as embodiments of continuity and of national integrity. In other words, of conservative principles that militate against any form of agency among young women. Indeed, when in these narratives girls are called to be part of the national colonial project, they are socially static and no real evolution occurs in them from the beginning of the stories to the end. So this gendered perspective that is almost completely absent in colonial literature, we will see that is going to become prominent in the postcolonial text. So we will see how the postcolonial texts reverse this gaze. So overall, this tradition in general, the child and the colonial subject are simultaneously addressed and simultaneously constructed as beings who require governance. So the one by the adult and the other one by the European civilizer. And I will add also from men, so the adult men. This convergence is a structural feature of the colonial imagination as it operates within children's literature. And as I would like to argue in this lecture, it is precisely this structure of double oppression that the corpus of contemporary Italian postcolonial children's literature sets out to dismantle. So the study of postcolonial children's literature is a relatively recent interdisciplinary formation, and it has not been as popular as one could expect, considering the popularity of postcolonial studies at large. The first article on the topic was written by Perry Nodelman in 1992, and in this very pioneering reflection, Nodelman applied the Saidian framework of Orientalism to the relationship between the adult and the child. So the Oriental subject in Said's account is constructed as incapable of self-representation, as requiring a mediating voice, and according to Nodelman, so is the child. As Rodrigue McGills observed in the monographic issue of Ariel, devoted to postcolonial children's literature in 1997, the child remains, even in a nominally decolonized world, among the most colonized subjects on the planet. He expresses this paradox by saying that, and I quote, "If we assume that the term postcolonial designates a time after imperial powers, that have departed in one way or another, and that the postcolonial voice is a voice speaking its own authority and identity in confidence of that authority and identity, then children only express a postcolonial voice after they have stopped to be children." A scholar whose work has influenced me a lot is Claire Bradford, and she argues that the gap between postcolonial studies and children's literature can be traced back to a tendency in children's studies toward universalism, that is the focus on shared symbols and patterns across childhood. But she also points out that because the field has been largely dominated by British and North American scholarship, there has not been more emphasis on race and historical perspective than on developing a fully postcolonial approach. And in fact, as you can see here in the slide, when myself I started my own research, all the scholarship available was directed almost exclusively to Anglophone postcolonialism. And so I refer to Italian postcolonialism following scholars that way before me has started to address it. And in particularly, and just briefly, I would like to mention that the adjective postcolonial applied to the Italian context was applied to the Italian context only in 2004. And then it developed furthermore. And I would like to quote from the Italian Postcolonial. It was a book published in 2012 by Cristina Lombardi Diop and Caterina Romeo, because they urge us to relocate colonialism in Italian history, to rethink Italian contemporaneity on the basis of its colonial past, and eventually redefine Italianness on the basis of gender, race, and colonial legacy. So when I started to work on this corpus, many scholars already pointed out how important it was to do it, and still is. Caterina Romeo in 2017 referred to Italian postcolonial literature as a body of literature produced in Italy by the first and second generation authors from approximately the 19th onward, encompassing both migrants coming from former Italian colonies and also migrants coming from those countries that were subject to other European colonial powers. So she basically divided into direct and indirect postcolonialism. So when I decided to work on postcolonial children's literature, this category of children's literature that I employ encompasses a range of textual forms such as picture books, silent books, young adult fiction, and graphic novels, united by circulation within the Italian children's publishing market. To give you some numbers, we are talking about more or less 200 books, maybe something more, 250. And the first work that has been done on this corpus was published in 2010 by Lorenzo Luatti. In this volume, E noi, il posto degli scrittori migranti nella narrativa per ragazzi, and Us, the place of migrant writers in children's literature, that gave a first bibliography of this corpus. So he kind of gathered all the works written from the end of the 80s until 2010. And already at the time, Luatti identified some tendencies in the early period of this corpus. So there was like a testimonial strand that was grounded in autobiographical narratives and oriented towards the representation of the migrant experience, and then a folkloristic fabulistic strand composed primarily of collections of tales from various traditions. And I don't really have time now to discuss it, but maybe we can take it take it later. This first, let's say, phase of migrant literature, as it was called at the time, was also heavily exoticized. So, of course, we could find like this very these autobiographical narratives focused on like the migrant experience, but also like books such as fairy tales from Somalia and so on. And also like most of the publishers were associations, besides Sinnos that was a publisher, but there were Associazione Africa 70 and other associations that were like promoting this kind of production. I started to collect the texts published after 2010, and I posed that this corpus went through two significant transformations. The first one was that there was a progressive diversification of themes and forms, accompanied by a loosening of this autobiographical testimonial imperative. And then the second transformation was the emergence of a substantial young adult literature written by the second generation. And I also want to mention that the second generation, the Italian second generation, is actually very active also in visual arts and music. So after gathering the corpus, the problem was, as I already said, defining how to study the corpus, because all the theories I had were directed to Anglophone and Francophone literature. So I decided to proceed by analyzing what I called a postcolonial imaginary, so a set of explicit and or implicit images capable of resisting paternalistic and orientalistic narratives. So more specifically, I traced the ways in which protagonists, and we will see how many of these protagonists are girls, acquire narrative agency, and also the ways in which the linear consequential logic of dominant historiography is disrupted through the fragmentation of memory. So these processes that I identified, I argue, happen along three axes: language, space, and color. And each axis has been identified independently as a site of struggle within the postcolonial tradition, broadly understood. I also want to mention that already Bradford, in her book Unsettling Narratives, had used language and space. It is precisely, I argue, through language, space, and color that the double colonization I described earlier, so the child and the racialized subject, is enacted and can be undone. So I will use the works of Ijaba Shego to prove my choice. And Ijaba Shego is one of the most well-known writers that we have in Italy, postcolonial writer. She is an Italian writer with a Somali background, and I chose her because she is quite representative of my corpus, but also because she is quite widely translated. So maybe if any of you is interested in the topic, can find a translation. She has published a lot of novels for adults, but also she has published a lot for children. So we will now see the children part. And I will start by talking about language. So the first analytical axis is language. And language is, in the colonial tradition, the primary instrument of domination. So the colonial text does not silence the other. It speaks for her, scripting her appearance, her gestures, her sound in ways that serve the needs of the colonizer's narrative. So, and as you can actually recall, the history of Vanoise, in the history of Vanoise, Maso was not able to speak. So he was performing this appearance of speaking, producing sounds that were designed to be comic. And the postcolonial literary tradition, as we know, has theorized and practiced the appropriation of the colonial language as a site of resistance. So the famous writing back in the master's tongue while contaminating it with other grammars and other voices. So in many texts I examined the insertion of words and phrases in Arabic, Somali, Tigrinya, and other languages constitutes a formal refusal of the monolingual norm that governs the national literary canon. But here I don't want to talk much about the the grammar part, but I would like more to focus on the narrative one. And I take the example of La mia casa è dove sono, My home is where I am. That is a book, one of the first ones that Shego published in 2010. So this book is an autobiographical book. And Shego tells the story of her diasporic family coming from Somalia, and she does it so she talks more or less about her family and her own identity by mapping the city of Rome. So each chapter is devoted to a location in Rome, so like the terminus station, a square, a statue, and so on. And every time she talks about a space, she also adds and meditates on belonging and colonialism. So the non-Italian words are scattered throughout the text, but they don't appear uniformly across the narration. So, for instance, in these sentences that I wrote here, the narration with these terms shift toward memory. So, whenever there is a retelling of stories heard within the family circuit, then the counting of these words grows. And at the center of this transmission, there is the mother of Isjaba, who tells her daughter stories coming from Somalia. So this retelling becomes a powerful means to contrast the racist insults that the protagonist receives at school, and that exposes her to a stereotypical depiction of Black people. So, for instance, she is associated to a slave. In reflecting on this practice of retelling, the protagonists say her, and it's her mother's stories, had a purpose. She wanted me to understand that we didn't come from nothing, that behind us there was a country, traditions, a history. Through her stories, my mother freed me from the fear I had of being a living caricature in someone else's mind. Through her stories, she made me a person. So this retelling has done the function of contrasting the stereotypical representation of Blackness given by the Italian society at large. And it is a gendered practice that belongs to, and it is enacted by the mother and the daughter. So whereas colonial children's literature completely obscured women and gendered experiences, postcolonial literature replaced female agency at the center of the critical discourse. And here I make also like a point of all the corpus where these women and so also retelling mother-daughter is quite prominent. But the book, the same book, also records some moments when language fails completely. So for a period at school, Ijaba cannot produce any sound, so she cannot talk in the classroom, while outside the classroom with her own family, she is very talkative. And what is compromised, I think, is not only the capacity to speak, but also the participation within a narrative that refuses certain subjects and certain stories. So another character that refuses to participate to someone else's story can be found in this picture book, Lend Me Your Wings, the story of Clara the Rhino. It was published in 2017, and in this story, the protagonist is Clara, a rhino that was brought to Venice to be exhibited in a freak show. So she was captured in the north of India and then transported to Europe. So at one point of the story, the two child protagonists that you can see here in the image, Suleiman and Esther, enter the stable where she's imprisoned to introduce themselves to her. But as soon as they enter, they discover that Clara doesn't speak. So her story is recounted by a cat that you can also see in the picture. So the cat will retell all Clara's story from the captivity to the freak show. And the text own logic complicates any simple reading of this silence, because in the word of Prestami Leale, of this picture book, non-human animals have a human voice. So it is quite remarkable that Clara doesn't talk. So there is an absence where actually a voice should be. And it is, as I read it, the same as with Ijaba, so a refusal of participating to the dominant narrative. But here we talk also about space, because colonial geography was, among other things, and as we saw briefly before, the demarcation of territories. So I spoke a bit about this mapping frenzy. And it was like the organization of populations, the impositions of names to lands, but especially the confinement of certain bodies in certain spaces. And in the history of Anoz, the racial transformation of the protagonist is inseparable from the spatial one. So Maso was inserted in a circus, that is a space constructed entirely for entertainment. So the body painted in black is placed within an architecture built around the logic of the gaze. The body of Clara is not only racialized, as she's coming from India, but it is also a gendered body. And before being sold to the current, Clara lived with her previous owner, Jan Albert. However, so Jan Albert got her when she was very small, but however, once she grew older and lost her grace, he sold her. And there is a scene in this book where Clara is depicted as breaking all the ceramics of the room, and this is like quite common in the corpus. So there are many girls that challenge traditional models by disrupting, by being loud, and especially they do not meet expectations both of the patriarchal and the adultocentric society they live in. So the story resolves with Clara flying away and recovering the possibility of free and independent movement. Postcolonial texts engage with space at multiple levels, so from the domestic space to the urban space, the transnational space of migration, the illegal journeys, and so on. And a strategy that is quite very present in the corpus is countermapping. Countermapping countries that have been misrepresented. And of course, when we talk about misrepresentation, Africa is the continent that has been most misrepresented and stereotyped. So as we have started with Anoz at the beginning of the lecture, I find interesting that in another work of Shego, the nose is used on a reversed way. And I will just read it. So, first and most important piece of information, Somalia is the nose of Africa. Yes, the nose, and it looks out over the Indian Ocean. So, fascinating enough, we also have the affacciarsi in Italian that I translated as look out, which reminds us once more the act of looking and not to be looked upon. The third axis is color, and color is a historical and discursive construction, as Giuliana and Lombardi Diop put it. The racialization of skin color, including the construction of whiteness as the unmarked norm, is one of the most durable legacies of colonial epistemology. So in texts like the history of Anoz, blackness was not simply associated with inferiority, it was made spectacular. So the black body was something to be exhibited, gazed upon, held up for the amusement and instruction of the white child reader. The postcolonial text returns precisely to this artificiality. And as you can probably remind, both Bilbo Bull in the cover that I showed you and Maso were painted in black. So we are talking about a color that is not only skin color, but is like a construction. So this kind of artificiality is taken up by postcolonial texts. And to explain this, I will use this short story inside the Magic Box by Jaba Shego, published in 2018. This story is a story of Dag that is modeled on the Ethiopian-Italian documentary filmmaker Dag Maui Imer, who lives in Verona. So one day, Doug is walking around and he sees a girl, Efa1, who is in the city with her family. And suddenly, some orange men start to address them with racist insults. The story will end up in a positive way, but what I would like to do today is to analyze the colors used. So Doug moves through the city of Verona carrying a magic box in which he collects everything he sees: faces, emotions, stories, but above all, he collects colors. So let's read what colors he's gathering: the white of the mountains, the blue of the sky, the green of the trees, the brown of the skin. Doug Maui likes colors. He likes yellow because the sun is yellow. He likes red because the heart is red. He likes violet because aubergines are violet. In this chromatic world, there is no hierarchy between colors. So each is anchored to an element of the natural world: mountains, sky, trees, sun, earth, aubergines. And the brown of Doug's skin is simply one of the elements of this series, no more and no less remarkable than the yellow or the violet. So the syntax performs this equivalence. In the rapid first sentence, the brown of his skin is listed among the other items, embedded in the flow of the natural world, and it is simply part of the ordinary fabric of things. The same, significantly, is true of the girl F1, who is introduced not through the color of her skin, but through the red of a skirt. She has a red balconette skirt. So her blackness becomes narratively visible only when racist aggressors force it into view. And that forcing into view is precisely what is identified as the act of violence. So the antagonists of the story are the orange men, whose color is not natural, meaning they were not born like this. And unlike the brown or dark skin, which belongs to the inventory of the natural world, the orange is a choice, is a way of being in the world that can be adopted or discarded. And in fact, to prove this, some of the orange men have orange hair, but not orange skin, so the color is a tint, is artificial. So there is a difference between color as part of the natural world and color as a social inscription, as a carrier of values that a culture can assign but also reassign. So Doug's brown skin belongs to the former, while the orange of the racist belong to the latter category. And this distinction brings us to think what Gretchen Papassian has acutely observed, talking about what she called multiculturally minded picture books, because some of these books manages to showcase that semantics attached to the colors are not only artificial, but because of their artificiality, they can be manipulated. So this lesson is reinforced by the function of Doug's magic box, that at this point I can spoil is a film camera. So it's an instrument of counter-narrative, and it collects the stories that the orange men want to erase, the faces and the colors that their aggression seeks to render invisible. The orange men take some paint and with a stroke of a brush erase everything. Wherever they have passed, people almost no longer have a mouth and are forced to use straws to eat, because the mouth becomes so small that it is almost no longer visible. So the act of filming by Doug is an act of naming, of restoring visibility. And when Doug films the scene of racist aggression against F1 and her family, he is refusing the anonymity that colonial and neo-colonial violence imposes on bodies, insisting against the staticity of the representation of the other. So where the colonial archive produced images of blackness as a spectacle, so as you remember, the blackface of Mazo's painted face, the postcolonial text produces images of blackness as a discourse. So I'm gonna go towards the conclusion, and to make like some general some general observations. Most of the texts feature protagonists that are, especially girls, that are disruptive, loud, asserts their desires, and rarely follow the codes imposed on them by adults. And through constant resistance to rules, succeed in reshaping their lives according to a model free from the protection of both adults and men. And here I want just to remember Clara when she breaks her master's ceramics. So these protagonists explore their alterity in various contexts, not only by questioning the definitions and domesticated norms imposed by the Italian society, but also by interrogating their multiple belongings, seeking to define themselves within a space that isolates them as different. On the other side, the text of the corpus disrupt the linearity of a sequential narrative. Instead, they create alternative stories, rewriting collective memory through an intense negotiation of one's own language, space, and color with the language, the space, and the color of the other for an inclusive elaboration of history. These stories respond to a methodological subversion of writing that decentralizes hegemonic narratives, bringing forth new perspective. So to conclude, in times such as those we are currently living in, working with, promoting, and reading children's literature written by minorities is urgent, because I believe children's stories not only propagate narratives, but as we saw, they can also challenge them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I'm sure that there will be many questions. I do have a few. But yeah, so we can begin with my question, and the others can formulate their own. Because your analysis is grounded in post-colonial theory. How might a decolonial perspective, particularly its emphasis on the ongoing coloniality of power and knowledge, change the way we interpret contemporary Italian children's literature and its racial imaginaries? I was thinking about the difference between post-colonialism and decolonialism, the colonial thought. It was just like the first thought that I had.
Yeah, no, this is like a question I get quite often, actually, because there is a lot of discussion on post-colonial studies nowadays, and also there has been also, because it was born in the West, so there are out of post-structuralism, so there are a lot of critiques against it, and in choosing post-colonial, I stick to the field of post-colonial Italian studies that was already there when I started to make my own research. And I believe that, we got theories coming mostly from US, or mostly from the Anglophone field and the Francophone field. So I feel like the post-colonial studies really are productive in this context of Italian literature and furthermore arts and everything. So I always choose and I always continue to use post-colonial for this reason, because I was sticking to that. So that there is actually a manifesto of the Italian post-colonial. So it was already there. Saying this, I'm not against decolonial studies or the perspective of decolonization. I just chose, to stick to that. Maybe from a traditional point of view, let's say.
Thank you. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. It was just, a thought that I had. I know that there's this ongoing discussion, let's say, going on. And another ongoing discussion is the one connected to the canon. To what extent does the inclusion of second-generation authors in children's publishing actually transform the literary canon? And to what extent might it risk reproducing colonial hierarchies by institutionalizing certain, let's say, acceptable forms of post-colonial difference?
Well, here we have to make a distinction on when, how, because as I said very briefly, when this literature, and here I'm not talking only about children's literature, but I'm talking also children literature for adults, was started to be out in the Italian publishing market. It was very heavily exoticized. So it was precisely because there was like phenomenon of migration. Then migrants were asked to tell their stories. So there was also like a kind of exploitation of their stories. And there are like scholars that have talked a lot about this. And in this children's field, of course, I can see it, especially from the 90s, the first 2000. So there is this, like it's a very blurry exoticate. I mean, it's like on the one hand, you can enter the market. On the other, you are exoticized. But I think after the 2010, there has been a change in this. I don't know if there is like a canon of children's literature today, first of all. And secondly, I don't know if they can be included in this. But I believe that children's literature as a field, also like publishing and production, is a bit more democratic than the adults one, whereas second generation and first generation authors still struggle to be recognized. So for instance, Ijaba Shegu was like the first Black author to be included in the National Prize in Italy, and this happened like a couple of years ago. So yeah,
that's fascinating. Really, that's really fascinating. And are any of these books present in schools? Are they a part of school curricula? Are they read by children, with teachers? Are they included in the education of a typical Italian child, or are they not present there? Because you mentioned awards, yeah, so that's important. But what about education? I'm asking this question to give you context, because last time our guest Dorota Michuka talked about migration, and she focused on also on schools, on education, and the importance of such narratives and their presence in a school curricula. And I'm just wondering whether these perspectives are present in Italian schools.
Yeah, I have to spoil that I am a literary scholar, so I work very rarely, or I'm starting now actually to work like also with the educational part, and also when I started this work, COVID happened. So a part of my work was supposed to be in contact with Italian schools, and it didn't happen. But I can say that one of the picture book that I showed before, that is about the Clara, the rhino, that was like a project that was born out of a scholastic project. So I think like I don't think the average Italian kid is in touch with this literature, but I know there are like a lot of associations that work with like literature written by second generation. So I was in contact like with some associations in Rome, for instance, and I think it is up to the school to explore the possibility of have this kind of like educational path, let's say. I'm not sure if they are in the curriculum at the moment, but is it a very interesting question, and I would like to be able to answer actually.
yeah. Thank you so much. And I hope that the question was not too unrelated, let's say,
no,
your research. Because I think that such voices should always be included in school curricula, but we know that it's really difficult to do that. I think that we have more questions, so I'm very happy about it. So I won't have to come up with more questions. And as you can see, sometimes the questions that I come up with, which in my head are very simple, end up being more complex. So apologies for that. But we have more questions, and Ella, would you like to?
Yes, we have 2 questions in the chat, but also 2 hands raised. So,
wonderful.
So I don't know which should be first. Maybe we give voice to our guests.
Okay, so let's
Anna Travagliati, yes, I think that is the first person. Hello.
Thank you so much So, Anna, this was a very interesting talk, so thank you so much. I was really surprised about the story written by Bamba, the author of the Giornalino di Gian Burrasca. I know that this book, Il Giornalino di Gian Burrasca, is widely recognized as children's rights against the violence of adults, both in the family and in institutions as boarding schools. So I was wondering, oh, it's possible that such an author who was on the side of children was also a racist and wrote such stories with racist caricatures and no attention to black children, for example. So I was wondering about your perspective on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for this question. And actually, so the History of Nose was a book that I rediscovered very recently, and the parts that are in my slides are quite adulterated to respect with all the rest of the book that is like absolutely horror. It's like horrible, honestly. Also because like Maso, then it is like studied by an Orientalist professor that measure his nose. So there is also all the discourse of like scientific knowledge on like skulls and stuff. So it's very strong. And yes, I was very surprised when I read it, but not so much if I think that in those years, some or like throughout the first decades of the 20th century and furthermore, racism was like really transversal. It was like everywhere. So like, I mean, even if you dig in other writers of that period, probably you can find some common feature on this. And I mean, the same fact that on the Corriere dei Piccoli there was Bilbo Bull, and I was like very fascinated by the fact that, for instance, the kid was naked, and it was like a moment where a white kid could never be naked on a cover of a journal, of a magazine. And this is also like all the discussion that is in that book that I showed you, that I really suggested to look up, because these characters were like really everywhere. So the more you dig into that, the more you discover like writers that, yes, were fighting against violence against children, but only a certain kind of children.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. We have another question from Justina Drzewczak. Justina, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. Really eye-opening for me. And I'm curious, if I heard correctly, you also work on posthumanism. And I'm wondering if in your work on those post-colonial readings of these texts, if posthumanist theories also come up. Are you considering intersections of post-colonial approaches and post-humanist approaches in your work? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, well, I have been looking a bit at animals in this in my corpus, and I published like an article some years ago that is also included in my book partially, and it was about how racism is explained through animals, and so like for instance. Clara is a rhino, but in reality she is a symbol, or like she represents like a racialized and gendered body. If I have to talk about really post-human theory, it is a bit hard to detect, because all the non-human animals that are in these books are metaphors of humans. So even the silence of Clara, because I mentioned that Clara doesn't talk, which is like normal for a rhino, but I mean, it is a real exception. And there is only actually one book that now you made me think about it, and that is talking about migrants as things that live. So there is this very small book that speaks about things that at one point decides to live. So for instance, the coffee starts to live, the a lot of goods, exotic goods, and it's set in Milan. And at one point, everyone start to live, and so the city kind of emptied, become like emptied. But that is also like not a very good reading, right? To associate migrants to goods such as coffee or tomatoes. So I haven't really intersected that. I have to be honest.
Thank you.
Okay, so now I think that we can read the question. There are two questions, but first, thank you, Anna. You started with a wonderful synthesis of the archive of colonial period children's literature. What is your sense of the continued presence and circulation of these texts today?
No, I was very surprised that the history of a nose was republished in 2011. I'm against it. I am against the republication of these books, especially when they don't have any critical apparatus explaining that this is like a racist product. But regardless, I am against it. So this opens up a very big chapter on also classics that propagate normalized racist views. So if I have to choose a side, I would be against it. And then of course there are it's a very big discussion, I think, to talk about what is the status of this literature, because on the one hand, I also felt kind of guilty in being interested in looking at these texts, because why would I do that? Why would I put visibility on this? But then, of course, when you put them in a critical, under a critical perspective, then it's different. But it is, for me, it's a constant negotiation of my own also sensitivity towards it. So I don't know, I could never write a book on colonial children's literature, and that's it. So I hope I answered.
Okay, thank you very much. And the second question from the same person, there is no name, sorry, so I don't know who's hidden behind this question. You explained, okay, we have, so maybe you can just read your question, because I can see the hand.
Yes, sorry, that was me. I didn't realize that my name was not on there. So both those questions was for me. Thank you, Anna, for this wonderful presentation. And my first question about the archive was, and thank you for your thoughtful replies. I was even just thinking about the use of the word archive, because I'm wondering if that gives the impression that somehow these books are no longer out there and circulating, that one can only find them on a research trip to an archive or to the library, when, my sense is that some of them are actually continuing, right, to circulate today. And then my other question was just, to get a broader sense of your corpus. It makes a lot of sense that you focus on Szego today for the reasons you explained. But I was curious if you could just share with us who are some of the other authors that you look at, and particularly the ones that focus on girl characters, because I also find in my own reading of related literature that is about migration in Italy, that there are far many more texts about boys than about girls. So I'm always curious how that, what are some other books that you've looked at that might feature girl protagonists? And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's true. When I talk about the archive, I talk an archive for me, in the sense that this particular example that I took, it has been republished, but then they are available, but they are available. Regardless the last publication, that is an exception in this corpus, because most of them have not luckily been republished. But all the others, you need to really go to certain libraries in Italy. I mean, and I was searching for like all the editions of the history of Vanoise, and it was very difficult to get them. And I had to travel there. You know, they were like scattered around. Also, to make like a genealogy of this book was like quite difficult. So I talk about archive, maybe not referring specifically to this case, but I think that a lot of these books are available, but are very difficult to get. So that's why I call, maybe archive also reminds me a bit of this colonial amnesia of this project also that I was talking about when I started.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. And while the second questions, I have a lot of titles with girls that are protagonists, and I might send you a list, but in general, it is a women's dominated field, both people that study this literature and write, and the girls that are in the books. I can actually send you a list if you are interested, but I think like there are also a lot of graphic novelists like Taqwa Ben Mohammed that speaks about these little girls that rebel against also the they seek to kind of impose their own view, and I'm sure that you know even better than me what I'm talking about.
Thank you. The question, I was thinking about the archive, and every single time when I hear the archive, I think of Aleid Asman and the archive at the canon and this binary. And I think that the term archive really works in the context of this literature because these colonial texts, which, as you've said, should not be republished because they're very problematic. They belong, in the archive. So we should study them. We should know that they existed, but we should not canonize them. So there's this binary, archive versus the canon. It's connected to collective memory and cultural memory, and it's up to us if we want to move things from the archive into the canon, of cultural memory. So I think that the fact that you use the term archive, it just works in the context of so many different things, not only post-colonial theory, but also memory studies.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. Yeah. The problem of colonial archives and in this specific case of black-faced coded characters, I mean, they are dangerous outside the archive. Very dangerous, especially now.
Exactly.
So there are like different kind of minorities that belong to the archives or do not belong to the archives, and of course I'm pro taking them out, but it's complicated. It's like a very difficult process because like to republish a book like this, it is extremely problematic.
Yeah, exactly. I think that we have time for one more question. Ella, am I right?
Yes. Yeah, I think for one more question. Yes. And please go ahead.
Hello.
Hi, hello.
Good evening. Yes. Good evening, all.
Good evening.
I'm Dr. Yatina from India. Thank you, ma'am, for an insightful session. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was so informative and thought-provoking. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Okay. So, ma'am, you have given us a lot of explanation and gave us lots of references. I want to ask a question in very general. Am I audible? Yes. Okay. To what extent the post-colonial text, Italian post-colonial text, challenge Eurocentric narratives while still risking subtle cultural hierarchies?
What do you mean by the second part? I didn't get the second part, sorry.
it's in a three-way interpretation. One is, of course, you have explained lots of post-colonial texts from Italian context.
Yeah.
So how far it is challenging the Eurocentric narratives and how risky it is to understand the subtle cultural hierarchies represented in such narratives.
Well, first of all, thank you for this question, because it opens up another thing that I didn't maybe stress enough, but all the texts I consider are written by second generation or first generation. So when I talk about post-colonial texts, I refer only to authorship. Because for me, like, if I write a book on children's, well, whatever book I want to write, then it will reproduce it, right? So I really stress the authorship in general in all my research. So then I feel like there are some books that kind of reproduce some logics that are hegemonic, and they really do. I mean, they are quite problematic. So it's not that all the texts published that I consider post-colonial, they are all going through dismantling a Eurocentric perspective. I don't think so. But then on the other side, I also feel like whenever there is an authorship that is so strong, then I should trust that in a way. But it doesn't matter that I don't find them critical sometimes. So there have been like a couple of books that I critique, like the ones that I was mentioning before, like to speak about migrants as goods. Then that was actually a suggestion by Maria Truglio, who spoke before, and she made me notice that it was problematic, this aspect. So I do believe that not all of them make like the best choice, but then I mean, at one point we need to compromise also as people that study them, that if there is an authorship, then I feel like to step back a bit. I don't know if I answered. I hope I did.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your lecture once again, and thank you for all the questions. Oh, Nina is here with us. Okay, Nina, so the very last question now.
Say no.
The very last one.
Oh no,
the very last
it
one.
was not a question. It's sorry. Thank you everybody for the lecture and the comments, but it was just maybe a comment or to the last thing about Eurocentrism. I don't know all the books that Anna has discussed, but I think in particular the one that she mentioned by Shego, the one Mia Casa, Dove Sono, my home, the one with which takes place, so to say, in Rome, because of course Rome, like it's apart from the British view, Rome is also in one sense the center of Europe, so to say, like considered in many ways as a very potent cultural place. But I think exactly just it's maybe not challenging only like Eurocentrism, but her way of the way it's narrated, it's challenging the form of a novel. So it goes against some kind of Eurocentric narration tradition, but still this originality can be found also in other texts. But she disrupts the European geography, so to say, or the center of the European geography. She disrupts by visiting all those places, but from another point of view. So that I think is a very nice example of really challenging the Eurocentrism. That, do you agree, Anna? That was I wanted to ask, do you agree? This is, I think, is a very good example of that you can challenge by form also, not only by
bringing ideas or contra narratives, but actually contra form, so to say. This was a long thing, but I think that this book is very rich, and I think it's to read that book carefully brings a lot of gather a lot of your perspectives. So thanks once more, and sorry for being a little bit slow finding my hand. Sorry.
Thank you, Nina. And yeah, of course, this is like a very good example. It's like a perfect example, like where I was, today I was like synthesizing a bit on the second part of the research that was actually about forms, because one of the points I insisted more is that even picture books, graphic novels, they give more space to disrupting narrative, or like what I called like this sequential, consequential linearity of a story. So that is a very good example, because the map per se is like is not consequential. So you have like a map going around, and that was a very interesting example. There are many more of like both of mapping, both in a visual and a verbal way. So there are like maps. Like drawn maps in these books, but also like I believe even the linguistic part, so like even disrupting the Italian text, the Italian fabric with other insertions, as we know, is like a kind of form that go against the hegemonic or Eurocentric perspective. So thank you for this comment.